warm welcome for Joe Walker.
Thank you.
Hope you can hear us. We are really very pleased that we can welcome Joe Walker here and discuss his collaboration with several directors and films like Sicario, Blade Runner 2049, and many more, and Widows, of course, you've just seen. But maybe before we get to these films, could you tell us a little bit about your studies? Because you were born in London, you studied in York, but it was not film studies department.
I spent the longest time trying to work out whether to do music or film, and I'm still a little confused by that question. So I've sort of done both careers, and then I've ended up... I had a late lunch, I'm sorry about that. I'm with some zoo animals. I mean, it all started when I was 12, and my parents had been given a 8mm camera for a wedding present, and I took it over, and I used to play Keystone Cops films very slow, and I used to play my father's Wagner very slow and kind of get depressed. And I used to like that feeling, and I was experimenting with both music and film to a degree when I was a kid. So I studied classical music and then worked my way into the BBC. I used the techniques I'd picked up with quarter-inch tape and synclaviers and fairlights and things like that were new, and started working as a sound editor on drama at the BBC. And eventually into film. That's a very 3 sentences summing up a very long time.
And could you be more specific about the BBC experience?
The BBC, I was lucky because they had a trainee assistant film editor course. They don't run it, I think I was the last year, and 2,000 people would apply, and they gave 12 places, and they would let you spend 6 weeks in one cutting room and 6 weeks in an arts cutting room and 6 weeks in a music cutting room. So you really had a year to find out where you gravitated and what you wanted to do. And I pretty quickly discovered that I liked the drama cutting rooms the best. And so it was a great experience. And as an assistant editor, you would have to look after the sound. Your work as an assistant editor was almost like being a librarian, remembering where every frame of 16mm was. If it's on the shoe of the director, as he or she leaves the cutting room, you have to kind of pull it off. But the thing that kept my mind alive was always building up sound effects that you could use later when you came to be the sound editor of the film. So it was a really great training and education.
And from this education, you continued to first collaborations on TV films. Which were those?
I did a lot of. Originally, I was doing quite a lot of, as an editor, some music documentaries. I did quite a lot of that. And cutting together things with 8 cameras looking at an orchestra. And then I got a break on a crime drama called Out of the Blue, and I felt I'd been waiting for it for years for this break, and then finally when the break happened, nothing happened. It's like I did this drama and everybody liked it, and I thought I'm going to be working forever, and actually nothing happened. But as sometimes life is like that. But, I ended up leaving the BBC. I came here to Prague in 2001 and cut a series here called Dr. Zhivago with an unknown Keira Knightley, and had a great time in Prague and kept up my love for Prague. And eventually, I went freelance and started to do film work. But it wasn't really until I worked with Steve McQueen the first time on Hunger that I found an artist that I really wanted to work with, and I felt that I complemented very well.
I would like to stop a bit longer at the time of Dr. Zhivago. Could you tell us a bit more, not about being in Prague, but about working on this title?
Well, it was an Italian director, Giacomo Campiotti, and a British producer. It was Granada TV, and it was the last of the really well-funded British period dramas at the time. And they came to Prague for many reasons, but one of them I think was that the locations were fantastic for Russia, and also that they had great horsemen and amazing swords and armor, and the art department was particularly strong here, so they came to Barrandov. And I worked in a little cutting room in Barrandov with my assistant, who's here tonight, Blanka Kulova. We had a great time together. So it was, happy days. But it was, I did get very frustrated with television. And I kind of, at some point in the 1990s, I just said, I can't do television anymore. And I was just angry because one of the last things I did was it was a great series called The Devil's Whore, and it's a brilliant British TV director, Mark Munden. But what was annoying to me is that they'd spent millions on the shooting and they were spending tens of thousands of pounds on the editing, and we had 3 weeks to do a 60-minute episode, and honestly nobody saw the film that hadn't already been involved. And at one point I even turned around in my cutting room and I saw the producer turning the pages of the script while we were watching the film. And it made me angry because there were things that I was concerned about that maybe the audience didn't understand. And in film, certainly with Steve McQueen and with Denis Villeneuve, there's the chance to show your film to an audience, and it's not academic at that point. It's nothing to do with the script. It's does the film work? And I felt that that was an essential tool to being a good editor, is to test and see what it feels like in a room of people responding to your film. And there are things that you think are going to work that don't work, and these are the moments where you have to kind of part company with them. So on this show, we had 3 weeks an episode, and in fact that ended up as 2 weeks because you're talking to the composer and doing a little bit of VFX work. And I ended up thinking, I'm done with television. I want to work on films where you at least have a little time to get it right.
Hunger is very political film, very physical experience to watch it. It's a very strong debut film from a director that came from art background. It's a Turner Prize, the Turner awarded artist, and it also is a film that has very long shots and very long sequences, up to 15 minutes or something like that. So editing this film was, I suppose, at the time very unusual experience for you, and your first experience with Steve McQueen. So how did you work together, or did you need to used to his style of work in the editing room?
It's true. I mean, there's some very long takes. I mean, one of them is 17 and a half minutes long. There's a dialogue scene, and really the editing challenge, because hardly anybody talks in the first third of the film, then two people talk a lot in the second third of the film, and then nobody talks again as Bobby Sands moves towards death. And that's kind of interesting. I was very attracted to that anyway. I was sick of dialogue. And it in a way, you're trying to escalate in the first third of the film the violence between these two opposing factions. And then just at the point where you really need to discuss it, there's a profound and in-depth discussion. And then we move into another sphere at the end of the film. So it kind of felt like you have to build up to that point. I did discover in the course of cutting Hunger that part of the trick of having these long takes is what you do either side of them. It's not just about being slow. It's about sometimes, I think, in editing, if you edit too much, then you're holding the audience's hand and you're doing all the work for the audience. With a 17.5-minute long shot, where genuinely you can't really see the actors, they're in silhouette. You can see the plumes of smoke from their cigarettes, but you can't really see their faces that well. But what happens is something strange. The audience, I think it's a little bit more like being in an art gallery, that maybe you look at something and then you detach, but then when you realize that it's not going to cut, it's not going to help you, you're invited in and you reapply. There's something strange happens when you put a border around this discussion with no editorial interference, and it does help an illusion that it's real, and it involves the audience in some tension. The actors definitely felt tense. I mean, they spent a whole week in a hotel learning the dialogue and practicing it over and over and over again. So there's a sense that all of us, none of us want to drop the ball. We're all on our toes. And but the secret to the editing of that, I think, is sometimes that you build up to it and you accelerate towards it, and maybe you cut time later so that you preserve this sense of a border around a piece of time and something really happening.
We will maybe get to it later again, to this topic,
sure.
Like building attention. Hunger and shame are, at least in my opinion, very symmetric movies. Also, you mentioned this big discussion scene in the center of Hunger, and no talking before and no talking after, which is also a central position and very symmetrical approach. How did this develop?
I mean, I think that's in the nature of a very artistic mind of Steve, and he's had this long-term collaborator, Sean Bobbitt, who shot Widows, and he's shot all of these films that we've done. But he'd been working with Steve and Sean have been working together for, I think, 17 years, and they've done many art films together, things for galleries. And they just have an eye, and they have an interesting way of working. They just they don't plan too much. They actually make a lot of decisions on the day, and they're really obviously interested in the body. I mean, in Hunger in particular, there are images from Hunger that are in my mind very much. There's one particular shot of Michael Fassbender when he's waiting for his bed to be changed, and it's an incredible shot of his chest, and it's very painterly. It's just a great combination of really brilliant artistic views, I'd say.
Let's move to Sicario, first film you did with Denis Villeneuve. We got a clip prepared, but before we show it, could you talk a little bit what happened after Shame? Because that was the moment you moved from London to LA, and that was a big career step, right? The passport to America was 12 Years a Slave. I had an American agent, but he kept sending me terrible scripts, and he just said they don't get you. And then 12 Years a Slave came, and everybody got me. So it was kind of that was my passport. And I mean, in truth, I'd been working in London, and I always wanted to work on bigger films, with a bigger reach and a higher budget. And I wanted to learn about VFX and bigger sound departments and, big screen entertainment is just always something I wanted to learn. But naturally in London, when a big American studio comes over, they will bring their editor. So it was very difficult. And if I'm allowed a moment of bitterness and sourness, I will keep this short. It was when I didn't get the job of second editor on Johnny English 2 that I thought
fuck them. Sorry. Okay, I'm back to positive now. There's a glass ceiling in Europe, maybe. So it was very difficult, and I wanted to work in America very much, and the first person who picked me up in America was Michael Mann, who is, like many American directors, incredibly knowledgeable about European cinema. So that was really a good step.
I thought maybe even Life in a Day was a certain kind of help in moving into LA and starting again in the US.
It put me in contact with Ridley Scott and Kevin MacDonald, the director, and it was a very international film. And, you know, I don't know if people know about this project, Life in a Day, but the idea was in 2011, they picked one day towards the end, in the middle of the summer. In context, if I can remind you, it was the first weekend when people stopped playing vuvuzelas, if you remember that. And we asked people to put clips up into YouTube to film themselves, something important to them on one day. And we ended up with 4,500 hours of dailies. And from 191, 192 countries, so in all different languages. We had Maasai tribesmen, we had Indian villagers, we had everything. We had a huge amount of North American teenagers complaining in their bedrooms, and that was a big, substantial part of the dailies. So we set out to try and make a feature film. And the way it worked was there was one editor, me, and we had a very limited amount of time, so we hired 24 researchers, brilliant people who would look all day at YouTube, and they would rate the quality of the clip, which meant that me and Kevin, the director, only had to look at a proportion of the film. I still watched about 300 hours, which is a crazy thing to do to your brain. It comes a point towards the end where you think, if I see one more clip, I'm going to forget my daughter's name or where I live, because there's no more room to remember anything. But anyway, we sifted through, and they also put keywords. If there was somebody shot a film about a nun who looks after chickens in Bolivia, I'd have 3 keywords, and if I wanted a Bolivian chicken and a nun, I would be able to find it and construct any film. And the secret in that film was the fact that that night was a full moon. So we ended up having hundreds and hundreds of clips of people talking about the moon or filming the moon or referring to, seeing elephants basking in moonlight in a lake, and beautiful material from all around the world. And it gave us this idea that we could do a day, and you could make a paper round. It could start with an Indian boy riding a bicycle, and then he takes a German newspaper out of his basket and he walks up an Italian set of steps and he puts it through a British letterbox, and a Frenchman reads his paper. So, this idea of trying to connect everything, and with the light and the dark and the shaping of the film, it ended up being cut in only 6 weeks. It was 6 weeks of editing. So that had a big tour of America. So yeah, it was another entry into that's where I met my agent. He came to a screening in Sundance. So it was another doorway into America.
6 weeks, sounds really crazy, unbelievable, but in this kind of montage-based supercut movie, that's the case where editor is as important as the director. How were you dealing with it in the editing room?
It's really, I'd say, the director is so important sometimes. The best relationships I've had with directors, is that me? Can you still hear me? The best relationships I've had is when a director is keeping you pointed in the right direction. You know, literally, it's like somebody always reminding you of where magnetic north is. And it's the worst kind of relationships, obviously, are where somebody's saying, you know, 2 frames earlier or 2 frames later. Because to me, I'll always find a good cut. You know, it's just an intuitive and easy thing to do. I'm much more interested in the help I need is to get those horizontal elements of a story working. And the best directors, I've been very lucky that the directors I work with are world class at shaping, you know, the pace of a movie or the meaning of a movie, and none more so than Kevin MacDonald, who's a phenomenal director. But even then, with a film of that scale, you're not even aware of what the themes are when you start putting things together. And it took us maybe 6 months or 12 months before when we met, we talked about the themes of the movie. And we realized some themes that neither of us had acknowledged, but there's a theme in the movie, for example, about missing mothers. And how did that happen, that there are so many stories in Life in a Day that are either about somebody who's dead or fear of a mother dying, or so many stories in that are connected. So, you know, there's a director's power and direction, but there's also something else magical happening as well between the both of you.
Okay, now about Sicario.
Sure.
How did it start for you? Like, you applied for the job, you didn't know Denis Villeneuve at that time?
I knew his film, Incendie. Has anybody seen Incendie? It's one of the best films ever made. So, you know, shame on you that only one person. I'd recommend. Incendie is an amazing film, and when I saw it, I thought I must work with this director. It's an incredible movie. And then an opportunity came up after working with Michael Mann. It's just there's something in his movies and in Incendie and in Prisoners, which was before Sicario. I didn't cut them. But there's something, the only word I can use is brainstemmy. There's something a little drug-like about the experiences of his films, and he's a master of suspense and tension and planning. So I knew his films, I knew Incendie, and I wanted to work with him, and I was just very, very lucky. I had a meeting, an interview, and then I got the job. But so I went to Montreal. I cut in LA while he was in Albuquerque with Roger Deakins and filming. And then I went up to Montreal, and very quickly I discovered we were very sympathetic. I wrote down, I found the other day on my phone something that I'd written down, which felt like a very typical statement from Denis. Very early, I think week 1 or week 2 on Sicario, he said to me, "I don't want to offend you, but I think we have the same sensibility." It's just the most humble and beautiful phrase. So I don't know, yeah, it was a very great, it was love at first sight.
So let's show first clip we prepared for tonight, which is from Sicario. So please, can you show the clip? There are 2 big topics we might discuss after showing this clip, and that's building attention, of course, and perspectives, maybe.
Yeah.
Before we do it, I just wanted everyone to remind you that we would welcome any questions. So if you'd like to ask, then just raise your hand and give us a sign. Ask, please. But regarding the tension, we have already mentioned it. It's built on several layers. The sound, of course, colors, the faces, actors, and editing. So could you tell us how all this was built up in the editing room?
I think one of the key distinctions of the sequence is also that there was no light. I mean, that's on the ground level, you're looking at thermal camera and the green, you know, I've forgotten what they call it, this camera, but they're real images. It's not a VFX. And Roger and Denis decided to shoot a night sequence without any light, which is odd when you think about it, how many sequences that you do see that are meant to be shot in pitch blackness but have got a giant light shining at everybody. On this one they had to take care when they were walking back to the unit because there was no light, and it creates a tension. I think there's something I liked very much and was trying to get in the editing is this nervous twitchiness of not really being able to see too much. The late addition in editing was the satellite shots. That wasn't originally planned. We had some material, helicopter material, daytime of that abandoned car, and my VFX editor Javier did an amazing job of putting little people on it, and just as a test, it felt like we needed a little bit of help to explain where they were going. But we also tried to avoid music until a certain point, and we just used the sound. There's a little sound in there with a little high-pitched feedback. We always called it the guitar solo, and that was just something that happened on the day. One of the radio mics wasn't connecting to the sound recordist. So, we used everything that came at us, all those little sounds, or the sound of bird wing flaps or something, just to kind of create the tension. There's a great version of that in the film Alien, where when they go off onto the planet, I remember being really struck how tense it is when you can't actually see what's happening. And you're when you can't see, then of course your hearing is much more alert. So we were trying to kind of make the sound very gritty and rhythmic. It changes very quickly. But I mean, it was great footage to edit, I must say.
There are points that it was probably clear when to cut, like people diving into the shadow. It was probably obvious that you will cut after the last soldier will dive into the shadow, but there were some open points during this scene, right?
Yeah, it was very free, very free. You know, something you mentioned earlier, which I didn't address, is a really important thing about this scene in this particular place in the film. So this, for those who haven't seen Sicario, this takes place towards the end of the film, probably, 2/3 of the way through the film. And what it really does, in my opinion, is it goes from Emily Blunt's point of view for the most part of the film. And then this scene is where you want to shatter that point of view and make it about many people's point of view. You're not really sure whether you're looking through Emily's eyes or Benicio del Toro's eyes or Josh Brolin's eyes or satellite eyes. It sort of becomes kaleidoscopic, because in the next scene, with a gunshot, we swap points of view to Benicio del Toro, who then goes further into Mexico and bumps off, kills the cartel boss. So it was kind of very important that this scene was a kind of fracturing of viewpoints. And we went to huge lengths in Sicario editing to try and work with points of view, to the extent that we wanted to make it so much about Emily's point of view that we cut a brilliant scene, I have to tell you, from the beginning. The original film, the first cut, the first assembly, had a scene. It began with Benicio del Toro waist deep in water, and you can't really tell. He's wearing a dinner jacket, and you think maybe he's having a piss in the ocean or something. But actually it turns out when you get closer that he's interrogating somebody and drowning them. And he pulls this little guy out of the water and asks him some questions, and the guy refuses to answer, and then Benicio del Toro throws him back in the water. But he goes too far and he kills him. So he takes the limp body, back onto the beach, and he gives him CPR and brings him back to life, and then starts interrogating him again. So it was like a brilliant scene. I'm sorry you haven't seen it, but by removing it, you start with Emily Blunt as she bashes into a house on a bust, and you discover Benicio through her eyes. You only discover Benicio when she discovers Benicio, and it felt like really important to make it about her moral point of view of fairly immoral acts, and to make it very concrete right from the beginning. So that's some of the thinking that was going into this scene.
And were you considering, like Denis Villeneuve and you, doing the sequel, the Sicario Soldado, or not?
Would have considered it, but we were already signed up on Blade Runner, I think. So it wasn't available. We weren't available. But it's a bit difficult. It's a bit like looking at, your ex-partner's child or something. It's not quite right.
Okay, we might go back to 12 Years a Slave now to show a different part of your work, editing actors, let's say, and faces, close-ups, and so on. So let's play a clip from 12 Years a Slave now, which should be one of the very specific shots, and we could comment on it afterwards. When and where was it shot and something about it?
It's interesting. Originally there was another scene with Brad Pitt, and it was something off about the kind of rhythm of having another scene, and yet we wanted to convey time passing. And for a long time the producers were saying, should we have a chevron, saying 6 years or 7 years or something. And me and Steve would say, well, no, if you're halfway through the film and it says 6 years, you might end up going, oh God, there's another 6 to go. So we ended up saying, we want to replace this scene, and that shot of Solomon's face was done, I think, the day after principal photography. Literally, we had 3 more hours with that camera. It was shot in a car park outside the cutting room. Solomon arrived with contact lenses in costume. There was no sandwiches or sound recordist. It was just a skeleton crew. And I remember Sean Bobbitt saying to me after that take, he said, the hairs on my arm went out, So it felt like we had a good take, really good take. But really the most important thing was to say, well, how do you tell time? How do you convey time in a film? And we felt that the best place to do that was his face. I mean, having read about the toll of all this work on the slaves' faces, and so many died young just from exhaustion or malnourishment or all sorts of problems. So it felt like the best clock we had was his face. And I think there are a number of things I could talk about it, but I kind of also feel for the character, it felt like in a way his despair had to happen before he could be. The very next scene, he's freed. And it felt like you had to go through that despair that he will never see his family again, for him somehow for it to be okay for him to be freed. It's weird. But it felt like the puzzle wasn't complete without a shot like that. So it's kind of magical. And, I suppose the other notable thing is it's a long shot. I didn't cut. And in it also he almost breaks the fourth wall, something that had happened in Shame. Almost by accident. It wasn't planned, I don't think. He just looks very close to the lens, which is, a challenge. There's something in a small way confrontational about that, I think. So I didn't want to cut. I felt like it deserved the time. I think 12 Years a Slave gave me the best opportunity I've ever had of being able to play with time. And, by changing the flow of the story, it was originally a story that began at the beginning and ended at the end. Like his book, Solomon Northup's book, it was chronological, but we ended up in the cutting room being very adventurous with the time structure, and we started in the middle and then went back, and most of the first part of the movie it becomes a flashback. Everything's in the rear view mirror. So it was a bold film about time, so it was a good opportunity on that shot to just hold things and really look into that man's soul.
And in this film also not cutting sometimes means showing pretty cruel things or being very, again, physical in the film.
Yeah, it's difficult. There's a hanging scene which has a long shot of Solomon hanging and dancing on mud, and how long to hold it. And Steve had this idea with Sean Bobbitt, and Steve did a film called Western Deep, which was an art film for a gallery. And when they were down in the deepest mine in South Africa, they just observed the way that the workers would never look at them, because they were there, Westerners with their camera equipment and different clothes, and they saw that the workers had learned not to look at them and not to cause trouble in a way for themselves. So they wanted in the hanging scene to have a moment where in the middle of this horror, people just walk around and get on with their day's work for fear of retribution. Nobody really interferes. So holding on to that very painful thing, it's just long enough for people to want to kind of stand up and say, stop it. It does develop a rage, I think, in the viewer, which is perhaps a good thing.
And for Steve McQueen and you, it was also a remarkable shift in the sense that hunger and shame, there is only a few characters basically, and it happens during several weeks, we might say. Now it's 12 years and many characters, even though one is central for whole film. What did it change for the collaboration in the editing room? Or was it planned so you were not dealing with this, or at least verbally dealing with this?
It's just so funny because when I read the script of Hunger, I can remember talking to people and they had no idea what a Turner Prize winning artist would do with a drama. And then he made Hunger, which is just the most extraordinary debut film. And then after Hunger, I heard about Shame, and I can remember somebody saying to me, yeah, but what's he, is he going to be, how's he going to deal with all that dialogue? I mean, they're going to need to do a lot of improvisation, and there's a lot more dialogue. And then he makes Shame, which has got some brilliant improvised dialogue. And then after Shame, people said, yeah, but, period films are really slow moving, and what will he do when he hasn't got that kind of fast pace? I mean, Shame was 21 days filming at night out of the back of a van. I mean, what's he going to do in Louisiana when he's got, costumes that have to be ironed or pressed or covered in tea stains or whatever? How's he going to cope? And then he wins the Oscar. So, who knows? I mean, Widows was similarly, I didn't kind of know what to expect, but, we're in the hands of a really great filmmaker.
And you were reading the Gillian Flynn's screenplay before the shoot started, or not?
Widows was weird because I was doing Blade Runner, and so I wasn't there during the shoot, and that's the first time that I wasn't very involved in the shoot. But I finished Blade Runner on Friday, and I got a call saying, do you want to come to Amsterdam on Monday? and take over the cut. So it was, I wasn't planning to work on Widows, and had been a bit of a heartache for me not to be able to do both, but it ended up okay. I ended up doing the director's cut and then post-production.
Widows, you have just seen it, has very strong opening scene that is very condensed, because there is 8 important characters in the film, and many of them, or all of them, need to be introduced in, 4 minutes or 5 minutes. So you ended up doing this combination of the heist and home, like kisses and goodbyes.
Yeah, it's intercutting the violent death of the husbands with the last breakfast, really, isn't it? I don't know. It was. I mean, I love how confrontational the opening is. It's very, gutsy, and it comes at you at speed. And I can remember in an early screening seeing somebody's popcorn go everywhere, and I was really pleased with that. I mean, it just tells you the main characters in such a short amount of time. But I think there's this tradition of great openings. I always loved that film Up, this Pixar film, because it tells you the whole story of a man's marriage, from childhood to that, in the 80s at the end. And it does it in 3 minutes. It breaks your heart in 3 minutes. So we wanted to kind of, do the same thing, I guess. I think also in the cutting, the other thing I was trying to do was bring out a little bit of the violence in their relationships and try to be a little subtle about it. But that could be, in editing terms, like the second edit of the film is Liam Neeson lurching at Viola, and then you cut to the crash. So it's kind of very chosen moment to cut, where it's kind of playful what they're doing, but there's just a little tension in there that you kind of identify.
And there's again this question about perspectives in this film, of course, because it's one of the subjects of the film, how the perspective shifted from a husband that is at least told to be dead to the wife and completely new companion, and some political perspective, and some social perspective and gender perspective also.
Yes. Well, yeah, I mean, there's 81 speaking parts in Widows, so it's kind of a complex duel in the editing room, because things changed and you want to change the order, and sometimes something reads so well in the script, and then when you look at it, it's, the moment of his reveal was much earlier in the script, and the funeral, I think, was in a different place. Well, I mean, here you saw in Widows a funeral before you saw the death. So there was some changes in order, and we were a little free with the structure. But also, I think one of the other kind of really satisfying things in Widows is that you establish all these spinning plates in the first reel of the film. And then once you've got to the sauna scene, I think, you know what the task is and what everybody's doing, and then you go cut extremely left to the preacher, Reverend Wheeler, and a big close-up, and you have no idea how he's going to connect to the story, or even where he is, because when you first see him, it's a long single take. In fact, that was the only take from that actor. It was he just got it in one. And then you slowly reveal he's in a church, and then slowly over the course of time you reveal his connection to the story. And that, I thought, was the kind of cool thing about this heist genre is, we enjoy seeing pieces kind of fit together. So a little toy that's, the girl speaks through a vocoder toy at one point, and then it's only, it's an hour later that you realise that that's part of their mask, and they're going to use it to disguise their voices and sound more like men. So I don't know, that was for me, the joy in cutting it was like seeing all those many little pieces come together.
You're good with numbers. Like, you remember that the longest shot in Hunger has 17 minutes, that there is 81 speaking parts in Widows. You remember exactly that there is 1,150 VFX.
I can add up time code
800.
as well. I can subtract time code. Yeah. Well, music and maths are a little useful in editing, I think, and I think they're probably part of the same part of the brain. I don't know.
No questions so far? Oh, okay, sorry.
Oh.
So, please, the question.
Hi, Joe. Nice to meet you. I just had a question for you about the scene earlier that we got screened by Sicario and the one in Widows. The first scene where I think Mulligan, if I'm getting the name correct, walks in to meet Manning. I'm studying film in Prague, so we got introduced to blocking. So I just want to know how much of it did the director in Widows block that scene, and how did you cut it differently from the way he did it, or did you just do it and then you spoke to him about it, or do you guys always speak about it?
It's amazing the conversations you don't have with a director. You know, you don't have a conversation about anything you don't need to have a conversation about, if you know what I mean.
No, I don't know what you mean.
You know, I don't know. I mean, and directors don't sit you down and say, well, look, I was thinking of blocking it this way, and why have you chosen that angle, or anything like that. I think if it doesn't work, then we might have a bit of a discussion. I say, I prefer to be on this. If there are two cameras, then I prefer to be this one because of the line, because there are moments when it's okay to cross the line, and other times when it's really horrible and you lose track of where people are. So you might have a discussion if you're trying to choose which of two cameras. But I mean, Steve and Shauna mostly shoot with one camera, single camera, 35mm. So the choices are not that many. They often only shoot 2 or 3 or 4 takes. I mean, it's a really big joy. Both Denny and Steve shoot very economically. Steve always says, because he grew up with 8mm film, and waste not, want not. That's what he used to say. I guess he was paying for the stock himself, so he was very meticulous about what he shot, and he doesn't overshoot. And he also comes from a very European school of believing in the shot. I mean, Widows is a little departure in that regard, in that there are those scenes with multiple angles. But where he can, I think he always tries to shoot in one shot, and then I don't have to have any discussion at all about blocking. Sorry, I don't think I answered your question very well. Sorry.
There's one more question here.
Yeah.
Please, go on.
Hi, so can you talk more about your usual day on the shooting? Like you said, you usually visit the shoots, so I'm very curious about how does the conversations there go on, if you talk about maybe the pacing of the scene, or you just comment on the various shots that you might miss later or something like that. How does it work?
From a very practical point of view, the reason why an editor would be on set is because they're worried about not having all the material while the set and the actors are still there. So there is a kind of insurance part of your job, which is to say, we didn't get it. And it's, funnily enough, it's one of the reasons I'm a little bit mystical about it. I don't like going on set. I mean, I love going on set, but professionally, I think it's better to be removed as much as I can be. Because, I just want to see what they're giving me. I don't want to go into this amazing set and see in my mind a wide shot when they haven't shot one. So I had also it helps to have a heart of stone a little bit. And I like to keep away from the pain that everybody goes through to make a shot, because it makes it a lot easier to cut it out. I had a really weird experience. I worked on a comedy drama set in Wales, and I turned up on set one morning and they were shooting, it was a big wedding scene. They had a huge tent and they had hundreds of extras all in wedding gear. and they had 50 cars coming up a Welsh hillside, and it was a crane shot, and it was climbing up the side of a building, and the building was actually derelict. And I met this lady who'd spent the whole night stapling plastic flowers to the side of this this cottage, and she was miserable. I mean, it had been raining all night on her. The food was terrible. She was cold, wet. She'd been working for 16 hours. And when we got to the edit, it was like the most impactful cut I could make was to go from a load of people who aren't going to make it in time to the wedding to them doing the speech. No crane shot, and it was just so much better. And when they had the cast and crew screening, I was hiding from this lady. It broke my heart a little bit. So I kind of keep some distance. And then the conversations are sometimes about performance. Denis, for example, I'll talk about Denis Villeneuve as a good example. He always says to me, I can't hunt and cook. So during a shoot, he's got to be focused on the next scene, the next scene, the next day, the next day. And it's so intense that I don't want to be worrying him in the background like a neurotic. So I kind of, the conversations will only take place if he's worried about a scene or if I'm really worried about a scene. And sometimes, they're really hard conversations to have. I worked on one film, not with Denis, a long time ago, and the first dailies of a particular actor were not good. This actor was doing too much, and it was really busy and ticky and kind of way too busy, and I kept thinking, God, that's the first scene in the film, and where's it going to go? And I can remember having a conversation with the director, and I just said, the best thing I could think of saying was, it feels like she's throwing 10 balls at us and I'm not catching any of them, whereas if she threw just one ball, I'd catch it. And then she can throw all the other 9, but just, in an entertaining way. And I didn't even have to finish that sentence because the director was having the same thought, and, it was just useful for him, confirmation that maybe he needed to kind of calm the performance down at this point in the story and that it wasn't going to fit. So it's a little difficult, those conversations sometimes, but that's what they would be.
Okay, one more question.
I have a question about Arrival, because this particular movie is narrated from more or less perspective of the main character, but at the first third, or maybe like in the middle of the movie, we have almost documentary sequence. Where did this come from, and why have you choose to use it?
So can you hear the question upstairs? Can you hear it? Oh, no? Do you want me to repeat it?
Yes.
The question is about Arrival, which is a film narrated basically from perspective of the main character. A film opened by a documentary sequence, or nearly.
Not open, but in the middle of something like that.
Okay, and sorry, the end of the question was?
Why?
It come from and why?
Where does it come from? Yeah.
I mean, it is a little unusual. One of the things Arrival we felt we had to change, that idea of Ian's character, he gives basically a speech about the 10 things we don't understand about heptapods. And it was partly because we had a number of scenes inside the spaceship, and we felt that we were at a critical number of them, and there were too many. And so we wanted to convey some of that information from scenes that we deleted. We also, in the original script and in the original shooting, there was nothing of the outside world. So you didn't have all the things that we put in later, like news clips, to explain the increasing paranoia out in the world. So, Denis saved our asses by doing some B-roll shots of soldiers looking at blank screens, and then we filled up the blank screens. So we were being inventive about the outside world, which we felt was missing in our first assembly. And at that point, one of the things we wanted to look at was all of the spaceships around the world. So it gave us, that sequence gave us an opportunity to show these spaceships in their 12 positions around the planet. And it felt also that Jeremy Renner's character, we always wanted to give him a little bit more than he had. It was, it felt, for example, at one point, the producers came back to us and they said, it's the MPAA, you know, who give you the rating of a film, have rated this film 12, and that's not good. And we were saying, well, what do you mean not good? And they said, well, if you could just put one swear word into the film, it'll be 15, and then kids will think it's cool. Whereas if it's 12, they'll think it's for children. So we ended up giving Jeremy Renner the only fuck in that film. I can't remember where it is, but he just did it really well. So we said, okay, you've got the swear word. So I don't know, there were lots of reasons to do it. And there was also, the other one is I wanted to put a joke in. I'd had a joke, it was my silly joke with Denis. I was saying that, you know, this idea that nobody can understand why they chose the 12 places to land their spaceships. And the only viable reason was that Sheena Easton had had a hit song in all of the 12 places. So, and that was too good a joke. I thought it was too, I'm sorry, very egotistic about my joke, but I wanted to put it into the commentary. But I admit it's an unusual thing to have a second commentary, almost like a documentary feel. But I felt that the film had voiceover already, so a little bit it was helping me.
Okay, one more question and then we will move to Blade Runner, okay? So, please. Yeah, go on.
If I remember correctly, you said that in the Sicario clip, the satellite shots, they were not planned. Is that right?
They weren't planned, no.
Okay, so the question is, how did they happen? Like, was that your idea, or was it the VFX editor? Or like, because it's kind of like a, now in retrospective, it makes perfect sense because it ranges the same, like the sequence. And it's like perfect because we see it through night vision and through infrared and we see it through
Yes.
satellite. So it kind of breaks it down, but then it kind of stays in the military vision. And it's all great, but how do you go to the position, hey, this scene needs a satellite shot that we didn't shoot, we don't have it. Like, how did that happen?
Well, when we
So
first...
I will just keep it short with for the part of the cinema. The question is about the satellite shots in Sicario we have seen in the clip. How did this happen, basically, if it wasn't planned?
I mean, it's you know, it's like you're in the cutting room, whoever you are, whether you're the director or the editor or the VFX editor or my assistant Mary or, you know, anybody involved. We're all like a pack of dogs and we're hunting and straining at the leash to find the problems and the logical problems in a film, or the, you know, what are the flaws? And once you know what the flaws are, creativity comes in and you know, solutions become many. The difficult thing is knowing what the problem is, right? So in the case of that one, originally we tried to just cut only points of view and never to kind of try and give any context, to try and get this paranoidal, tense night vision experience. And then having done that, we just genuinely felt that we'd lost the geography and we didn't really know that they were moving towards a target. And it also helped us to, you know, that it was literally because we felt that we didn't explain the pincer movement in the footage that we had. So we needed something else and we had this extra footage and we worked on it. But it also helped in lots of other ways, being able to hear those little voices all around you. And like the eye in the sky is such an interesting thing. And I think, honestly, one of the ideas came from, I was listening to a podcast, Radio Lab. And Radio Lab had a podcast about the eye in the sky, which they'd used in Juarez. And it had been invented in Afghanistan, the idea being that they were losing the battle against roadside bombs, and by taking a photograph every second over Kabul, they could see an explosion, they could turn the clock back and work out who put the bomb there, where did they drive from, where did they drive from before that, where did they get paid, where did they pick up the bomb, and through that they managed to bust a major cartel. So I felt it's not meticulous historical military research, but I felt it was very likely that a raid like this would have a satellite point of view. So in terms of whose idea is it, in the cutting room I always say, you don't split up the record collection until you're getting divorced. So I think it was our idea.
How big was your editing department team on Blade Runner?
I have my assistant Mary, and Mary had an assistant in Budapest, a local assistant, and then my VFX editor had his assistant who's more of a digital artist who came over from Los Angeles, and we had a local assistant, Balázs, who was from Hungary. So it was a team of 1, 2, 3, 4, 6. And then I have a sound editor who came on a little later, who was starting to work. I mean, on a science fiction film, it's very difficult. I would normally work a lot on the sound, but on this one, you've got fans, you've got wind machines, you've got rain, you've got snow, you've got everything that makes sound recording really hard on set. And also, there's no sound effect of a spinner that you can take from a library. You have to start inventing. And it was really important to me. I think the sound on Blade Runner is really good, I've got to say, in Atmos particularly. But one of the things that was very good about it was the casting of the sound team, because the sound team is a mixture of a traditional Hollywood sound team represented by Mark Mangini, who's won his Oscar for Mad Max and films like that, and my guy Theo Green, who comes from a much more left field background, and it's symbolized even in the sound of a gunshot. There's Denny didn't like the sound of the blaster from the original Blade Runner, so they needed to record a new sound of Deckard's blaster, and that was recorded. Mark went off into the desert and recorded guns with hundreds of microphones miles apart, and then came back, and Theo added to it the sound of I might get this wrong, but it was the kick drum sound from 90s dance music, and it goes doo, that sound, and the two together is the kind of sound of the Blade Runner blaster. So it was kind of a marriage. It was just a beautiful marriage of big screen entertainment sound world and weirdy, beardy, European-y sound design.
Were there more things you didn't like about the original Blade Runner?
It's very rapey. We're in troubled water with digital companions in Blade Runner 2049, but I think it was handled okay. But the scene where Deckard and Rachel in the first film, where he pins her up against the wall and forces a kiss on her, is hardly modern. So I was kind of glad to avoid that.
More questions about Blade Runner, maybe?
Can I ask you why? Can you tell us more about why Johan Janssen was removed from making music, and why you ended up using Hans Zimmer instead of?
Tell us more about why Johan Johansson wasn't in the end doing the music for.
They just went in different directions. That's the simple way. We need a longer time, and let's have a drink. But Johan Johansson, I love Johan's music, and the collaboration was so fantastic for Denny on Prisoners, and to a large extent, Johan's entry into the world of cinema music was through Prisoners. So they had a tremendous bond. Denny had to fight for Johan to write the score. And then on Sicario, The way that we used to work was I tried to avoid music in the cut, like I said earlier, and Johan would write sort of music in the abstract, and we were cutting this helicopter scene, the ride into Juarez, and this track, you know, the boom, bam, boom track turned up, and me and Denny we were dancing in the cutting room. It was ridiculously good, and it just arrived, and he would give us stems, the original, you know, the constituent parts of the music, so that we could edit against picture. And then I'd send it back to him, and then he'd enhance it or remix it or rewrite it sometimes. And that was the process on Sicario, and it was also the process on Arrival. I mean, on Arrival, he gave us 2 pieces, I think, very early on during the shoot. And one was that wah, 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 wah. I'm singing it very badly, but that, you know the one? And we ended up just putting that against the spaceship and going, that's amazing, and so on. So it was very collaborative, you know, on Arrival 2. And then I think basically what we came to need in Blade Runner was we realized we needed thematic music. And I don't think we were going in the same direction. I mean, one of the things that really works about the original film, in my view, is Vangelis's score. And if you think about it, Vangelis's score is like really optimistic, you know, da da dum bum ba da da dum. I mean, it could be a cowboy film, right? They're coming over the hill. It's heroic and major key, positive, and it works because it's like a kind of cracked optimism against the dystopian world that you're in. So if you're putting music on Blade Runner 2049, which is even more, I'd argue, dystopian, then I think music that is equally dystopian doesn't work. And we went a long time together trying to kind of fix it, both sides working very, very hard to try and find something, and ultimately, you know, it didn't work. And we had a very Hans. I've known Hans for a long time. I worked with him in the 80s, and I worked with him with Steve McQueen on 12 Years a Slave, and I've known him for a long time. And we basically bashed his door down. And once Johan and Denny parted company, and they were very friendly with each other about that, I have to tell you. And you know, but then we needed to get the music together really quickly. And Hans was about to go on a tour, and he was packing, and we kicked his door down, and we said, can we show the film? And we watched the film, and 2 minutes after we saw the film, he said, well, I can tell you what I think it's missing. I think this is what you need. And he started working on a tune, and it's the tune that is in the film. It's in the seawall sequence. It's in the film, I think, 2 or 3 times. And it's this beautiful melody that is never really gets to a conclusion. I mean, it's just something that Hans does really well. These melodies that are striving and yearning, but kind of in an edge really close to resolution, but don't get there. It's tragic in a way. And unusually, and like Vangelis, in a major key. So Widows is the same. The music for Veronica is major key music. It's not the automatic, the first thing that would come to most people's minds if they were writing music for Veronica, I think would choose a minor key with lots of suspensions or something. But in Hans's case, he somehow creates another atmosphere, a mood maybe of nostalgia for when things were good. And I think that's, you know, when, honestly, I was in the room after the screening of Blade Runner with Hans, and after many months of trying to get the score right and failing, Hans wrote the tune and me and Denny burst into tears, and we went, okay, great, we got something. So it's tremendously sad to talk about Johan, because he's just one of the best composers I think I'll ever work with, and it chokes me up. But it's sad it didn't work out, and we were hoping to have another chance to work together and make it right. So, yeah.
Yes, please.
I'm interested in your relationship with the director in 2 different parts of the work. One is
question about relationship with directors. What happens before the shoot starts and afterwards when the editing starts, basically?
I mean, I'll tell you about Dune. I mean, I was hired officially a week or two ago, and my commitment to Dune at the moment is setting up my team. Some very small discussions about how we're going to do it and what kind of team do I need and what are the VFX team planning to do. What are we going to do with sound? But I've read the script. I've kept away from the storyboards. I don't know too much the concept design. I have not discussed the project with Denis very much. And my concentration will be on, I've just finished work. I started work at the beginning of Arrival, and I finished last week. So my thing is I want to get fit, healthy, and ready for 15 months of hard work. So that's my kind of commitment. So distant, really. Then I might be involved a little bit before the shoot if they have any previs, because you probably saw from the previs it needs all the help it can get in terms of timing and getting a sense of, I mean, I get my assistants to do all the voices and we build up the soundtrack and try and give it more of a sense of the flow that we'll want. Because ultimately some of those shots are going to go to VFX companies, especially in Blade Runner where there were some shots that were completely CGI. So you have to get the timing right before you spend all that money doing it. During the shoot, as I explained, I would be present and involved, but not next to the director every day, but it would, more often than not, he would come in at the weekend on a Saturday and have a look at the edits so far, make some notes, maybe show him a second cut of something. Then when you're in director's cut, which is normally in Hollywood 10 to 12 weeks, if you're lucky, then I'm this close to Denis every day for long periods of time. And then it goes into sound and we may divide a little bit. He'll tend to be working very hard with the VFX team. I'll be working with the sound team very hard. We'll meet up and get together for ADR, and then we finally dub it and do the grading, and we're sort of, you know, in 2 or 3 rooms sometimes together. So yeah, you end up spending a lot of time together, and yeah, you better, you know, get on.
And have you read the Dune? Are your anticipations based on the book itself?
I've read the script. I read the book a long time ago, and I'm starting to read the book again. And I did an interview. Somebody asked me some questions in an interview, and I felt so stupid because I couldn't really remember the book. So I think I have to. I mean, there are fans out there who will be disgusted at how little I know about Dune, but I'm trying to keep fresh. I want to see what he does. I don't really, you know, that's the really important thing. I mean, you know, these are two. I mean, Blade Runner and Dune are both kind of Mount Everests of expectation. And they haven't always, you know, maybe previous versions have not been ideal or successful. So I'm just interested in seeing what Denis does, and I, like everybody else, I'm extremely excited about what he'll do.
Please go on.
Different question, but now I have a question. Do you like David Lynch version of Dune?
Do you like David Lynch's version of the Dune?
I thought you just said, do you like David Lynch? And I was happy to just say yes and leave it at that. He's a master. Do I like Dune? His Dune? No. But I'm in good company because I don't think he likes it either. I mean, there are some brilliant things. I mean, that, you know, there are some superb things in that film, but I kind of feel like the big mistake was trying to put too much story into one film, ultimately. And I think they changed things too much. I mean, my understanding of Paul Atreides was different from his understanding of Paul Atreides. And I think, you know, whether you're a god or whether people impose godlike status on you is a big shift to make. And I can't blame David Lynch for that, because from everything I've read about it, there was producer pressure and, you know, many things wrong. But I mean, he's a master, so what am I saying? I'm just throwing pebbles at a god.
But it might be important to note that you work also as a doctor like in the editing phase for different directors, different editors. So you enter projects of other crews just to comment it, to try to help them, and if they're stuck, or maybe the producer feels they are stuck in the material. So did it change your perspective on dealing with the material that is ready and needs to be edited?
I mean, do people understand that? A film doctor is somebody, film doctor is a terrible word. Denis says that I should call it re-engineer of existing materials. That's what he calls it. But I mean, it is common in Hollywood, and certainly on the bigger budget films, that if maybe somebody's got lost in an edit, and this can happen. You can have people who've been working for 55 weeks on a film, and they're showing it to an audience, and the audience isn't really loving it, and the studio naturally, we might as well bring in what they call the fresh pair of eyes. And it's sometimes amazingly easy to kind of see what's wrong with something that nobody's been able to see because they've been working on it for a year. So it's an odd situation. You have to have the cooperation of the director, and it's good to have strong opinions, but you don't want to be an asshole basically in how you express them, and hopefully it's of service. The thing I've really learned from it is, how do you develop those fresh pair of eyes for your own projects? That's the really interesting thing to me, and I'm trying to use every trick to keep my own fresh eyes, because it's so much easier if you parachute into somebody else's film and look at a cut, and you kind of see really clearly what could change or what could improve or what might be the problem of whether you're engaged in a story. Ultimately, it's about storytelling. How do you develop that instinct for your own project and stop yourself being resistant to change because you know the whole history of every cut, every shot, every take, every decision that's been made? And I mean, it's hard. I wish there was some amnesial drug that you could take in week 50 that gives you that moment. You come in on Monday, you look at the film and go, God, if only we did this. And I mean, the only tricks that I can come up with are, sometimes I will cut without sound. I'll just cut mute and just try and look at the film differently. And another trick that I learned recently is late in the day, flop the image. If you're an editor, it might be a useful tip. But if you flop the image of the entire film and watch it left to right rather than right to left, it's amazing, it's different. Our brains are prisoners of seeing and hearing songs over and over again. And in fact, the recognition factor of pleasing things is something that will prevent you from changing it while you're meant to still be changing. Do you understand? So I kind of feel like anything that breaks that, you have to look round a project. You have to look at it. The only analogy, when I was writing music, sometimes you could work on a little loop of maybe 4 seconds of music, and you're working so hard to make the bass occupy a different place from the guitar, from the strings. You're spending so much time doing fine tuning, and it's only when you go out to the restroom and it's still playing and you come back down the corridor, and it's like halfway down the corridor you can hear it, and you hear, oh my God, the drums are way too loud, what am I thinking about? When you're stuck in that little loop. So film doctoring is a kind of professional way of trying to preserve fresh eyes on a project, and it's difficult and challenging and politically difficult because nobody wants to lose control of their edit. But I think I've had a very good experience with it, because most of the editors that I've been working with who've already been on a project, they'll just see some of the ideas I come up with and they'll do their own version of it if they like it. So maybe you've brought something that was cut out of the film back into the film because you think it's missing, and they'll do a riff on that, and it becomes, a collegiate atmosphere at best. That's the best thing you can aim for. But it's, I wish I could do it in reverse to myself, as my own film doctor.
Please. Question?
What do you think about the concept of two editors for one movie? Because I happen to accidentally have three editors, and I thought
Yep.
that was kind of great for the freshness. Do you think it's possible to have this workflow?
I've worked on a film with a certain American director who likes working with three editors at a minimum. And I don't like working
that
that
was
way.
my command.
No comment. And they, here's the difficulty with my. It's just, I worked on a battle scene with Michael for 6 weeks, and at the very end of that 6 weeks, the notes I was getting from him were things like, raise the volume of that syllable 1 dB, remove 2 frames. They were so tiny notes. And one night, on a Friday night, you never knew whether you were going to be working on Saturday and Sunday or whether it was going to be a whole weekend off. You could never make a plan. And at midnight on a Friday night, he came up to me and he did that with my cheek, and he said, I think we're in a good place. And see you on Monday. So I was tripping. All weekend I thought, I've cut a battle scene with Michael Mann. And I'm the first editor who's, successfully, I've heard the legends that he keeps changing, but he told me we're in a good place and I've got the weekend off. Woohoo! So I come down the corridor on Monday morning and I can hear some dialogue from that scene, and I thought, oh, that's great, the sound team have already started. And I opened the door and there was a new editor. You go, holy cow, what's going on? He said, oh, well, Michael just brought me into, I said, have you seen our cut? And he said, no, Michael wants me just to start again. And he's like, oh, man. But that's, it's sort of the way he works, and then he'll take what's good out of my cut and what's good out of that editor's cut. And, that's the way he works. And actually ended up with a really good sequence that was a sort of combination of 2 or 3 things. What I find difficult is I want to know everything about a cut. I know every single frame that's been shot. It's part of my duty to watch all of the dailies. So if a director says to me, this isn't working, then I know all the possible remedies, because I've seen every inch of footage and I can imagine stuff that we could do if we had the time and money. So it's kind of having that level of commitment to what they've shot. Just being able to only see a narrow window of it means it's very hard. It's maybe good for the scene, but it's very difficult for the whole broad control of the pace of a film. Or do you understand? So I try to avoid it. It's very, very difficult to be the only editor on Blade Runner. It really is. It's a long day. It's a 16 or 17-hour day for most days for a year. So it takes a long time to be the only editor, and that probably means that I'm insane at the end of it and incapable of professional thought. But at least I've kind of, I've got a grip on everything. And sometimes there's a shot from one sequence that is going to solve a puzzle in somewhere totally different.
I'm mostly talking about like having one editor and then taking everything what we've done to the second one.
Sequential editors.
Two special editors.
Well, if everybody gets paid, I don't know, that doesn't sound great either. I mean, I want to work with Denny and Steve until I drop dead. I mean, I just, why wouldn't I? I just feel like there's such a shorthand to the conversations. We don't need to talk about Dune. At least I don't think we have to talk about it. I don't have to ask a million questions, of somebody who's already got 10 million questions being asked of him by everybody. It's like it's a very safe place for him to work and for me to work, where you understand each other and you can finish each other's sentences and make each other laugh, and you have without offending each other, similar sensibilities.
Last 10 minutes, please. So if there's a question, do not hesitate long and ask it.
There's a gentleman there.
Please.
During the editing of Blade Runner, were you somehow inspired
were you inspired by Terry Rollins' work on the original Blade Runner?
You know, one of the things that I really love about that is Terry Rawlings comes from a sound background. And I kept, you know, we used to screen Blade Runner a lot and just pick things out that we really liked. And some of them are sound and musical things. You know, the sounds, you can't really tell whether they're music or an atmosphere, like inside Deckard's apartment. These little wind chime sounds sometimes. And we brought that back in Blade Runner. There's always some musical atmosphere, and you can't really tell whether the sound designers made it or whether Vangelis made it in the original, and we tried to keep that idea. And Terry also, I think, is like, he's got great restraint as an editor. He's not overly cutty, he's not flashy in sort of some way, so I kind of felt a little kinship with him. Yes.
In Arrival, you spend so much of the cut like placing emotions on Amy Adams' face that aren't really there, like making us think that she's grieving a daughter that has not yet existed. So like, how much were you talking about that with Denis, and like how much was that a part of your cut? And especially when you don't have fresh eyes on that cut and you already know that her daughter dies eventually, how do you cut like that?
Again, the question is about arriving and placing emotions in the Amy Adams face and discussing it with Denis Villeneuve.
I mean, this is like a base. I mean, my career is based on a really simple editing trick, which if you cut from somebody looking really thoughtful to something, it makes it look as though they're thinking about it. You know, Kuleshov effect. And Arrival is that. I mean, we had lots of shots of Amy looking thoughtful, and we had loads of brilliant material of the child on the lakeside, or, you know, and it was very free what we could do with that. It didn't have to be in one place. So, for example, there's a shot in Arrival of one of the first hallucinations, I think it is the first hallucination, is of a horse in a stable out of focus. It's a fantastic image. Bradford Young, amazing camera person, and you could put that anywhere. But we were trying to kind of structure it a little bit so that actually the real key is sound, I think, as well, because the earliest hallucinations are mute. There's no sound at all. It's absolute silence. And then gradually, you know, there's a little stick in some water that makes a splash and it shocks her. And then gradually, you know, you're building to the point where the two things are happening simultaneously. You know, she's talking to a general in the future at the same time as making the phone call to him, you know, in the past, or how the two time frames are intercut. And each sound is equal level, and in fact slightly overlapping with each other. So, you know, you're trying to use all these beautiful images and build some pace and structure to them. In terms of emotion and planting emotion and how you bear that in mind when you know the outcome, I mean, I think all editors and maybe all directors, filmmakers have some idea of our own idea of the audience and what the audience will be thinking, and you're trying to kind of second guess that. And in Widows in particular, it's wondering whether you've stimulated the questions enough that the answers are satisfying, whether the questions are clear enough. And we had a lot of upheaval in the cut of Arrival because, frankly, in the original cut, it was people didn't understand. And when you test a film, people tend to just go quiet about those subjects. You know, nobody wants to look stupid, and it was a challenging film to put in front of them. But unless you understood the choice she was making at the end of the film, you wouldn't get the emotion that we wanted, the bittersweetness of that. So we ended up, I mean, the really lucky thing in Arrival was we had, you know, VFX had made these logograms, and we could just ask them to put a little squiggle on one of them, and we put a subtitle on that says, you know, "She isn't born yet, you dummy," or something like that. You know, she's your daughter, but she's not been. It's something really obvious, and it was a lot earlier in the film. So, and then in a cut, I think we cut to the child, and we had a little bit of ADR Amy says, "Who is this child?" You know, there are ways of trying to make the audience understand at least what the question is, so that the answer is a little bit more satisfying and that the emotion is possible. I think sometimes if you're not clear about the story, then you won't feel anything. You just become detached. And that was the opposite of what we wanted on Arrival. There was
Last
a lady
question,
somewhere
maybe?
here, I think.
Yeah, go on, please.
A lot of your recent films have incorporated elements of visual effects. I'm wondering, from the perspective of an editor, how you go about working with unpolished media.
A lot of your recent work is containing a lot of VFX. So how do you feel, or how do you?
How do you find the scope of the film, your fantastic pacing, with working with a lot of the elements of the film that aren't there yet?
Well, Arrival is a good way to talk about that, because in the shooting in the spaceship, there was no heptapods. I mean, they don't exist. I mean, the closest we came to it was at one point there are two people who are wearing green lycra costumes with a pole with a tennis ball on the top, which is like really not a good look. And, you know, what do you do to, you know, there are moments that I really hold long on things. For example, when the hand comes forward, I really wanted to hold that for a long time so that there was time to kind of look at the texture of the hand and really, really soak it up and have enough time. And of course, in a cut, long before the VFX are ready, it would just be a white screen. It would be nothing. There was no shot. It was just white. So the things I did, I mean, that's why I work very closely with a VFX editor, and, you know, he's by my side all the time, Javier Marchiselli. He's really brilliant artist with Nuke and After Effects and Avid, of course, which is like the customary editing kit in Hollywood. And all the time I would leave a space of how long I thought roughly something should be, and he would bring in some clip art from the storyboards, and maybe he'd get the arm to raise in a very crude way, and I'd say I just need it to move a little bit faster there or a little bit slower there. And the other big ingredient was sound. We commissioned, I'd seen the film District 9, and I loved the sound of the insects in that, or the bugs. And it sounded, we needed the same thing. We needed for something to sound like it is a proper language and that humans couldn't easily replicate. So there's this amazing couple in New Zealand called Dave Whitehead and Michelle Child, and they're a real life couple, but they work together on sound design, and they've done a lot of work with Peter Jackson, and they did District 9, and we hired them really early. Me and Denny both loved that idea, and they gave us the sounds super early on a very rough cut, which only had clip art, or sometimes nothing. And then that's a really good way to kind of like stay with your intentions to hold a shot a certain length, because the sound is kind of pushing you forward. I mean, if you're leaving everything to people's imagination, it's a very tough watch. So you have to kind of do some rudimentary work, and then pretty soon we started getting very early animations for the heptapods, and we could put those in, and you just chase it all the time over the course of a year, and you end up with version 612 of heptapod raising arm, and we never changed the length of a shot, I'm glad to say. It was just sort of, you need all those, you don't want people to imagine everything. You just have to give people enough things, whether it's music or sound effects or performance of some kind, just to build up the cut.
Okay, that's it for tonight. Big thanks for Cinergy, and especially, of course, to Joe Walker.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you, sir. Thank you.